Months we've been focused on the primary battle between former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the U.S. Senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. Democratic voters seem split on which candidate best represents the ideals of their party, but a larger question for progressives looms in the general election, when they'll be confronted with the foreign policy plans of their nominee, which is looking very likely to be Hillary Clinton. She's widely viewed as more hawkish than her former boss, Barack Obama, and some questions remain about how comfortable President Obama even is with leaving his legacy in her hands. But how deep are any rifts? And what is Mrs. Clinton's opinion of America's role in the world? I spoke recently with Mark Landler, who explores the topic in his new book, Alter Egos: Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the Twilight Struggle over American Power. He's covered U.S. foreign policy for the New York Times during both terms of President Obama. He's been the White House correspondent for the Times since 2011. Here's my conversation with him. Mark, the title, Alter Egos, and why the term Twilight Struggle?
Well, Larry, I took that actually from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. He talked about a long twilight struggle against the forces of tyranny, and it appealed to me because I thought it was a sort of an analogy to where we are now, where we're fighting this kind of long, low-grade battle against the forces of Islamic terrorism, whether it's ISIS or al-Qaeda. And I sort of thought in a way there was a parallel between the world that JFK was laying out in the context of communism and what the next American president faces in the context of Islamic militancy and terrorism and those kind of threats.
Hillary seems to be endorsing Obama, plugging Obama, and using much of her admiration for Obama in the campaign. Does that surprise you?
Well, I think, Larry, what you're seeing in the Democratic primary is that she's got to align herself closely with Obama in order to reassemble the Obama coalition and fend off this progressive threat from Bernie Sanders. So she's really drawn very close to the president. I think if, as expected, she prevails over Senator Sanders and pivots to the general election, you will start to see her delineate some views on foreign affairs that'll be somewhat different and I would argue somewhat more hard-edged than what we've seen from President Obama. There was a little of that in the time before the campaign really got into gear back in 2014. But as she faced this kind of unexpectedly strong threat from Bernie Sanders, I think she saw the necessity of hugging the president close, and that's the period we're sort of coming to the end of now.
Do you expect the president to strongly campaign for her?
I do, because I think for the president, speaking to my area of expertise, foreign policy, if you look at the things he cares about leaving behind, the climate change agreement in Paris, the Iran nuclear deal, these are things he's going to really need a Democratic president to preserve. Donald Trump has, advertised his doubts about climate change. He said he would renegotiate the Iran deal. So I think that whatever differences the president and Secretary Clinton have, and I argue they're significant in this book, it won't stop the president from recognizing the importance of having her succeed him and hence campaign very hard for her.
Okay, the survival of Obama's legacy might be contingent on whether or not she's elected. Will that legacy hurt or help her in the campaign?
Well, I think it's going to be challenging for her because Donald Trump is not the Republican she probably expected to run against. She probably expected to run against a more traditional Republican, say a Jeb Bush or a Marco Rubio, who would have probably come at her from the typical Republican position of going after a Democrat as kind of weak on national security. And that's where Hillary's more hawkish view could come into play. I think with Donald Trump, she's in this interesting position that he can come after her from the left and the right. He can say, you voted for the Iraq War, which I have, loudly proclaimed my opposition to. On the other hand, you worked with President Obama during a period when Libya got into terrible trouble, when Syria Syria fell into this disastrous civil war, when the Islamic State became this big power in the Middle East. So he can hit her as having been both part of what he'll say is a failed foreign policy, but also then having cast a vote for George W. Bush's disastrous war. And that's going to put her in somewhat of a tricky position.
Has Sanders pushed her left of Obama?
He's pushed her to the left for sure, and in one or two cases he has pushed her to the left. For example, I think the threat from Sanders was one of the reasons that she had to disavow the big Asia-Pacific trade deal that President Obama negotiated and which she herself advocated for as Secretary of State. And then, of course, on a number of domestic issues, she has been pushed to the left. I think she's kind of kept her powder dry on some of the core foreign policy issues, and so that I think that when the general election comes around, she can re-emphasize the strong stance she would take on Syria, on Putin and Ukraine, and some of these foreign policy issues where I think she is clearly to the right of President Obama.
I am very anxious to read this book. We'll start it immediately. You say the book will point out a lot of differences. Give me some.
Well, I'd say they're in a few categories. If you go back to the beginning of the administration, she was a very, very fervent advocate to send a large number of troops into Afghanistan. She actually favored sending in more than the Republican Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates. And she really gave Gates and the generals the political cover they needed to prevail in that debate with the president, who was more reluctant. If you then go forward, she was really the key voice, I think, in persuading President Obama to back the NATO airstrikes against Colonel Gaddafi in Syria. Again, he was reluctant, and she was much more forward-leaning. A little bit further on in the debate over what to do about Syria, she and General David Petraeus, who was then head of the CIA, argued very strongly for providing arms to the moderate rebels. The president pushed back against that and has continued to resist getting drawn into Syria. More recently, Clinton has come out in favor of a partial no-fly zone over Syria. That's something the president continues to oppose. And lastly, I would mention Ukraine and Vladimir Putin. I think Secretary Clinton's been pretty open in saying that she would probably have pushed back harder against Putin in Ukraine, probably by supplying the Ukrainian army with lethal defensive weapons. So those are the sort of the major areas where I've seen some significant daylight between the two of them.
Mark, do they like each other?
It's a good question. I think the answer to that is yes. But I guess what I would say is the following. They are it's still a very complicated relationship. They were genuine partners for a time during the first term when she was in his cabinet, but the sense of rivalry never really went away from the 2008 campaign. And the way I like to think of it is that the president developed a very warm personal friendship with Vice President Joe Biden. And I don't think you could say that exists between him and Secretary Clinton. On the other hand, with John Kerry, his current Secretary of State, I think it's also fair to say that he doesn't have quite the level of deference and respect for Kerry that he has for Secretary Clinton. So it's a complicated relationship.
Do you think that Biden would have been his choice?
I think that he, on an emotional level, would have favored Biden. And on some of these foreign policy issues, I think that Joe Biden is closer to Obama than he is to Clinton. I think if you look at the big debates over Afghanistan or the Arab Spring, Biden was the one counseling restraint, backing up the president. But I also think the president is a political realist, and I think at the end of the day, given Joe Biden's age and frankly, given Joe Biden's performance in his two previous presidential campaigns where he really never got past the Iowa caucuses, I think the president probably recognized that Hillary Clinton had a better shot at it. And as I said earlier, since his number one objective is to keep a Democrat in the White House, I think his heart might say Joe Biden, his head would say Hillary Clinton.
Is Hillary going to be more hawkish than Trump?
That, again, is a very good question, because Trump is so contradictory on foreign policy. If you listen to him, he'll say on the one hand he's going to bomb ISIS into oblivion, and authorize massive buildups in military spending. On the other hand, he says, I oppose the Iraq War, I want to get out of the nation-building business, and I want to withdraw American financial support for NATO and the security umbrella that we have over our allies in East Asia. So he's sort of sending this very mixed message. And I think that if you look at Hillary Clinton purely on the consistency of her message, it's possible that she would be more risk-ready to use the military, at least as a tool in addition to diplomacy, than Donald Trump would. And I think that might surprise some people, but you have to sort of listen carefully to what Trump says and get beyond some of his bombastic rhetoric.
Historically, how do we rate secretaries of state? Was Kissinger a great Secretary of State? Was Colin Powell? Who's a great Secretary of State?
I think it's an interesting question, and I think you have to separate out celebrated secretaries of state from ones with substantive accomplishments. Often the two go hand in hand. I think it is fair to say that Henry Kissinger, who is arguably our most celebrated modern Secretary of State, also did have a record of accomplishment. The Paris Accord that set the stage for the end of the Vietnam War, some of the shuttle diplomacy between Arabs and Israelis. I think James Baker arguably is the most consequential modern Secretary of State. His work winding down the Cold War, the Madrid peace process. I think Colin Powell, sadly, will be remembered largely for the role he played in advocating on behalf of the Iraq War. And so whatever good accomplishments he has, and he was a very popular Secretary of State, he won't be remembered all that well. The argument I make in this book is that Hillary Clinton, despite her enormous celebrity, probably ranks somewhere in the middle of the pack. And I think that's partly because the White House concentrated a lot of foreign policy influence in the West Wing, didn't give her a huge amount of leeway. And secondly, I think she was a fairly cautious Secretary of State, particularly in issues like the Middle East peace process. She really didn't take enormous risks. So while she was competent, I don't think she was a standout the way, say, Kissinger and Baker were.
The book again is Alter Egos, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the Twilight Struggle over American Power.